This is an elevated experience for sure. It's all the people at home, all the people in different Alamos. Thanks for still watching.
This is simulcasting. Will you tell us what cities?
Simulcasting in Boston, Austin, Denver, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, Dallas, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, here, live, Los Angeles, every city. It's in every city, basically.
What about Cleveland?
They have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I hear is excellent. But speaking of artifacts, speaking of places in time, really want to start talking about the film. I'm sure a lot of folks are processing and getting in their feels about it. I wanted to ask about the genesis of this movie. Where did it start from with you?
Thank you guys for watching. I'm sorry. I think I like to talk about the genesis of the movie before people watch the movie if I'm going to be there, and so I'm sorry that I wasn't here at the beginning, because I feel like the movie is like a bit of a bad trip, you know? And like ease, I like to Sherpa you into it, and then but I'm here to ease you out of it maybe. The genesis of the movie. I think there was an idea that had been stuck in my head for a really long time about trying to make something about the way that my childhood in the suburbs was sort of created in tandem with all of this media that I was watching about the suburbs, and this space that was weird in a way that I was just dropped into and had to sort of understand its weirdness, because the thing about the suburbs in the 90s, I think, was that everyone was this is the most normal thing. It was the platonic ideal of normality, and of course that's a dark idea, because what is excluded from normal, right, and the homogeneity that the suburbs is famous for, I think, comes from this sort of desire to sculpt a safe and perfect environment that ultimately ends up feeling kind of weird. But I just kind of got dropped into a Burger King playpen, and then slowly became sentient, and had to work it out myself. But then I was watching all of this television as a young person. This was the era of Snick and Heat and Heat and Are You Afraid of the Dark, and all of this media that was sort of in this post Spielberg way, being trust us, the suburbs is magical. And I loved so much of that stuff growing up, and I think a lot of my own mythology of my childhood and coming of age was created by a lot of those shows, and how I interacted with my space that I was in was sort of it was a religion that I was taught or something. And I think the movie is there was this idea very early on that I was obsessed with of one of those shows ending in this sort of unresolved way. As upsetting as the end of a Twin Peaks season 2, and those 25 years between its end and its revival, and it being such violence to the people who loved that show as a kid, that it almost feels their own pain or more painful than their own real pain. And I was just fascinated by that idea, and this idea of buried alive. Somebody else from your favorite TV show is buried alive, and it was never resolved. So how do you go on with your life? And I think my process tends to be that there's a kernel like that, and then the question becomes why am I obsessed with this? And in this case, it was it usually is, was oh, trans, and so then the movie, when I wrote the movie, it was during this moment of early physical transition. I had I'd come out a year earlier as non-binary, but everyone was sort of just cool, it seems like you're going through something, here for you, bro. And no one really took it seriously, I think, until I was okay, publicly, hello, I'm changing my name, I'm going on hormones, I'm going through physical transition. And the fallout from that, which I knew would be the fallout, it wasn't a surprise. And in fact, I think repression in many ways was a defense mechanism against having to deal with all of this. But my life blew up, and it was familial estrangement and just a complete reevaluation of home and privilege and the life that I had been told was the safe and structured life that I should have. And that was like both terrifying and really exciting, you know, and just like raw in a complicated way. And I think like returning to the idea of this movie while also returning to this like reevaluation of like everything that had like sort of informed that first like 30 years of my life, which I had thought of as like normal, but had sort of in hindsight now realized was like in many ways keeping me from myself. Yeah, just like trying to explore that in an honest way. Like I had learned through my first film, World's Fair, that like the best way to talk about really intense things, even if they're really intense trans things, is to like not really worry about like representation, is to just sort of try to use like cinematic language to like show how it felt or capture how it felt. And that really was my goal with this film, was like within this moment capturing like how overwhelming and complex and just, yeah, like deeply, it came from a really intense time, as I'm sure you can tell.
And I mean, with that, you're talking about this fear, but also you're reworking and putting that into its own mythology of a fictional space. So it's you're reconstructing all of that, reconstructing all those memories into this. So how much time, I guess, with that process did you put into the reconstructed mythology, even within the film, of the Pink Opaque and of the music and the whole like sort of media universe within that?
I think that like I think all of it came very naturally to me because I really did like live and breathe Buffy the Vampire Slayer growing up. You know, like I cared about Buffy more than I cared about like my real life, and just like having that consistency. Like when I was like 10, I watched the first season of that show like while it aired, and was just with it for 7 years, and it was like such like a tool of dissociation for me. You know, it was like in hindsight, I think very much a coping mechanism for not being able to form like the kinds of deep, like romantic relationships that other people can form when they're like an adolescent in the right body. Like I wasn't in a place where I could like open myself up to people, but there was this show that was so emotional that I could have this relationship with, but it was going to be one-sided, you know, and this fictional world that felt very queer in a way that at the time, that's not the language I would have used, but it was like giving me a place to go that was different than like what was allowed elsewhere. And I like would never talk about my love of Buffy. I was so ashamed of it, you know? It was like my like dirty little secret that I was like completely obsessed with Buffy. And yeah, I think I also like, I just always, you know, from the youngest age, like I didn't just watch it as a fan, like I wanted to like, I like loved spoilers because it felt like I could like peek under the hood, you know, like I was always like watching and like as an artist and as a storyteller, and like so that like language of like genre television was like, that's where I learned how to tell stories. And so it came very naturally to me, I think, to like not only make this show inside the movie that's speaking in that language, but in many ways make a movie that's speaking in that language. And like I think it's like there are obviously these like totems of Buffy in the movie, but I think in a wider sense, like this idea that like the big bad is going to send you to a nightmare realm where, you know, you're like have to be like in the wrong body and sapped of your superpowers, and like you're gonna grow old in that realm while your real self is like buried underground and suffocating. Like that's like a plot that you would see on an episode of Buffy in a lot of ways, and so like crafting a movie that could work both as like something that's speaking in like more of an art film vernacular that's like a little less straightforward than the genre language of 90s television, but that also is like faithful to that logic and sense of storytelling. That was definitely like a goal.
And I think that you absolutely capture with the Pink Opaque the vaguely Canadian aspect of most like Snick shows, especially art for the dark. No offense to Canada, great country, but they give us a lot of great art. But I just want to ask you, to mention Buffy, like Amber Benson is one of many folks that was in this movie that are from different elements of 90s television. So I just want to ask you specifically, what was it like going to her or to Fred Durst or to Big Pete, Little Pete, anybody else that's in this? Like, what was that process like pitching that to them, like this art film that vaguely relates to, not vaguely, it relates to their work years ago?
Well, thank you for the Canadian comment, because I always use the word Canadian when I describe this genre of television, and I feel like that's the first time I've ever heard anyone else dude. It's deeply Canadian.
It's intrinsically Canadian.
Because it's tax stuff, I think is the actual reason why it's Canadian. You know,
100%.
it was like, you could go to Vancouver and save a lot of money,
Yeah.
but like as a result, it just like, yeah, like one of the best things about the X-Files, right, is how it's like on the bottom of the screen, it's like Alaska. It's like the Sahara Desert, and you're just like,
The answer is no, it's
that's
not.
fucking Vancouver. Yeah, I think that it's funny because I feel like a lot of this can be done badly in like movies that I don't like the like Easter egg, as people would say, that kind of makes me shudder. Because like I'm not making a movie that's just like cool references, bro. You know, it's like. But one thing I've always been fascinated by is I don't know. I feel like there are filmmakers who like I feel like oh my god, I've been on tour for too long. Richard Kelly does this really well, especially in Southland Tales.
Yes.
And I think even like Kubrick does this thing, like when Kubrick casts Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman in Eyes Wide Shut, he's not just like, these are two fun people. He's like, these are the two biggest movie stars in the world, and they're ostensibly fucking. And so like, and everyone knows that. And so like, I'm gonna make a movie that like goes in aware of that, and uses them to like, kind of poke at notions of heterosexuality and monogamy and love and celebrity and whiteness. You know, I do think that that's like intentionality that's there in that film. And I think that's how I try to like think about those sorts of things, or like less Easter eggs and more just like filling out the movie in like a way that's going to deepen the ideas of the film. And that's very different for each cameo, if you will. I think with Amber Benson, it was like, that moment comes at a point in the film where like all of Owen's like mother figures have been stripped away very quickly. Like his mom, Maddie, has disappeared, and the TV show has been canceled. And it just felt like an extraordinary grace note to like let him get a hug, and for us to kind of get a hug and see this presence who, you know, in the context of like what happened to Tara, was like, for me, like a bit of like a corrective or something. Like I was like, I want to see her on screen. Like at one point we didn't actually do this. I wanted to like dress her in the same clothing that she was wearing when she got killed off on Buffy. It was just like really important to me that like, just personally as a fan, to like see that she's alive.
Yeah.
Brett Durst, I was kind of like, if I had a dream about like an angry dad glaring at me, who would my like subconscious cast in that role? And like, there's a million dudes out there who can play an angry dad, but there's only one Fred Durst.
One man lives on top of the toilet.
There's this moment on set, you know, yeah, he's a great performer. He was a great actor, I think, and cinephile. Like he like within 2 minutes of getting on a Zoom with him, we were talking about like Paris, Texas, and like David Lynch films, and but there's this what we did a close-up that didn't end up in the movie, and his like glare was playing too big in close-up. It kind of was like silent film, like fisticuffs kind of glare. And I was in another room on monitor, and I was talking to him across the room, and I was like, Fred, like you like it worked in the Y, but we just need you to like take it down. Just needs to be like a little more subtle. It's like, it's not like you're like literally like, there's not a thing you're angry about. It's just like, have you ever like woke up and you're like just kind of pissed off and nothing in particular, and you just like wanted to like do violence, but it's not, it's just a feeling. And then I looked at my AD, who's like a big, you know, like we have the same like pop culture vernacular, and he just shakes his head at me, and I realized, oh fuck, I've just paraphrased Break Stuff. I just like literally paraphrased Break Stuff to this man to like give them motivation.
Guys, it says, yes, I do know how that feels. Thank you.
And Seppi is here, my dear friend, and also my assistant on the film. Seppi, who's an Oakland native, is here, and you and Fred had a really close relationship. Seppi knocked on Fred's trailer at one point, and correct me if I'm wrong, you told him. I'm sorry, I did push you in there. I was like, you wanted to talk to Fred. Yeah, I know.
We all want to talk to him.
Yeah, and you told him, you know how like when you said that this song's for the ladies and the fellas and the people who don't give a fuck? You were like, I was that person. I was the one who didn't give a fuck, and he was like, I wrote that song for you. And he was a good sport. And Pete, I think it was like, if I ripped off Twin Peaks: The Return in the movie, it would probably be in the casting of Pete and painting them white like ghosts. And just like, for those who know, like, that for me was just all about like the uncanny nature of like aging and like seeing child actors as adults together, like as like almost these like specters on the same suburban streets that they used to be like kids on television on, felt like really ripe.
Absolutely. Well, I want to, we have time for one or two questions. I want to ask one more follow-up, but just to say, with these questions, have them be questions that end in a question mark, and also they can be vetoed if they're awful. Also know that your entire family's watching, and hundreds of people across the country are watching. Will judge you if you ask a bad question.
Not in Cleveland.
Not in Cleveland. We're safe in Cleveland after this. But I guess like, one thing we were talking about was the nature of like great movie soundtracks, and this is, I think, doing its damnedest to bring that back in a particular way. So I just want to ask particularly about your relationship with Alex G and Snail Mail and Phoebe Bridgers, and just the way you wanted to construct the music in this movie and how much it drives the narrative.
Well, we're all best friends and we go on vacation together. Just kidding. Although Lindsay parties. Lindsay's awesome. I mean, they're all awesome. I'm a music lover. I think that like a question that's come up on my press tour a bit has been like, when did you know you wanted to make films? And I think it was like the moment I understood that I wasn't going to be a musician. And so like it was kind of like always assumed almost. And yeah, like music for me was like as if not more important than like television growing up. I just, I clung to emotional media, and like teen angst music as a teenager was like so crucial to me. And so I think on one level I'm just like, why would you not make a movie filled with like things that like you love deeply, and like I love music so much, so like music is always going to be a big part of my films. But on this film in particular, there was this lineage, right? Not only of like the teen angst soundtrack, playing on this sort of forgotten era, or not forgotten, but past era of the like Donnie Darko of the world, but there was also, it was also like playing with the 90s, like how on like TV in the 90s, for whatever reason, between the music industry and the TV industry, there was just, it became the norm that like every TV show had a musical guest every week. And it was like, for some reason there's this like tiny town, but they've got this like cool club where like Biff Naked is coming to play.
Charms did that, because they owned a club and every episode would end with that.
They all did it, And Buffy was the bronze. So we basically, I pitched A24, mostly just because I wanted to make an awesome soundtrack, but I pitched them this idea that we were gonna make like the soundtrack to the TV show, and it would be like a lot of contemporary awesome bands like writing the song that they would have played if they had played on like the bronze on Buffy. And A24 kind of like went for it, and I just like found myself making like a mixtape, of all that. We commissioned 16 original songs in addition to the score, and I worked with each artist like really intensively, and then spent like a full year like obsessively sequencing the soundtrack. It's just like this work. I didn't think of it as like marketing for the film. I didn't even really think of it as the film. I thought of it almost as its own kind of like cousin creative project. And it was just like the most fun thing, because like I'm such a nerd, and this was just like a great opportunity to like be a nerd. Ryan, who's performs under the name Maria BC, is someone here. And they have a song in the movie, beautiful song that plays early on when Owen and Maddie have their first sleepover, and then there's this sort of montage that takes us to the carnival, and Owen grows up. That was Ryan's song. Thank you for being a part of the soundtrack, Ryan.
Shout outs. Let's give Ryan actual like applause. We time for one or two questions. So we'll take, and I have to repeat the question back to make sure the audiences that are not in Cleveland know what's up. So
can I make a special request about the questions?
Yeah,
no offense to anyone else, but if any trans people have questions, I would love to prioritize.
Yes, please. Yes, right there.
What was the most personally challenging part of the film to make?
The question is, what was the most personally challenging part of the film for you?
That's a good question. Like in terms of like my own personal like feelings, like not the most challenging thing to pull off, but like emotionally digging something up.
I was going to ask the first question, but then you said emphasis on trans people, so I was like, okay, I'll ask.
Yeah. The most like emotionally challenging thing to do, I don't know, like I think making something is such a joyful experience in terms of the making. Like I think, Seppi, right, we were pretty happy. There was never any like, ooh, I just had to dig up that really hard thing. I think the hard thing was more like working within a commercial system and working within like a system where there weren't a lot of trans people on the other side of the table, and like holding faith and a lot of space for myself to feel like really valid in the decisions I was making, even if they like weren't understood by people in other positions of power. That just requires like a level of like faith and resilience and like ability to like defend yourself, even to yourself. That was definitely like a years long process. And when I think about like pulling off this movie as like, I think a pretty like honest work, you know, and a deeply personal work that like I didn't really compromise on for legibility's sake for like people who, you know, weren't going to understand it because they haven't been through something akin to this experience in life. I just didn't do that, you know, and like when I knew I was going to make a movie with the studio and for like a bunch of other people's money, I was like, that's going to be intense, and it was, and like I'm so proud that I did it. Like it's like the thing that was hardest and the thing that I'm most proud of, I think.
Thank you. It showed. It was amazing.
So we have time for one more question, so sorry to cut it short. Let's see, I have a tough time seeing with the lights. Yes, you in the front. Yes.
I was really blown away by the setting. I wanted to actualize that. Like, what was the inspiration behind the setting? Because it was really familiar, but at the same time, so separate. Like, it looked like a suburb of it. Even in Glasgow, too. It had that same vibe. What was the inspiration?
Yeah, so the question was about the inspiration of the setting, because it feels both, you know, very realistic and lived in, but also, you know, very much not that. Very liminal, one would say.
Yeah, I think it's like, I mean, a lot of it is planning, right? And a lot of it happens on the page, and just like the selections of the spaces you want to be moving through, and the way that like those spaces look. Like so early on, I was like really attached to this image of like lunch tables turned over with their, I think I described it in the script as like turtles with their feet in there, you know? And like, I don't know why I was fixated on that, but it like said something about liminality maybe to me. And I think the movie is just like awash with like trying to capture, like something maybe like hidden underneath our more classical, like broader traditions of like showing the suburbs on film, you know, whether that be like kids on bikes with flashlights or like, you know, like even like something like Edward Scissorhands where like the suburbs are like so excessively bled of individuality or something. Like I was trying to do my own version of those things rather than like rely on existing imagery, like the tradition of almost like the cliches of the suburbs on film. But then I think a huge part of it also is like, because I grew up in those spaces, and because like my gaze on them was like always this, you know, like it's like when I made World's Fair, everyone was really confused about like why I felt so strongly about like grabbing a shot of the abandoned Toys R Us. I was like, that's the movie, you know, it's like, and like even when I was a kid, I was obsessed with like the shitty, you know, like decrepit, disrepaired Toys R Us. Like I was always drawn to these sort of like, like spaces where the suburbs had started to rust or, you know, show their sickness or something. And so location scouting this movie, like in the suburbs, I was just always on the hunt for that, you know, and like a lot of the movie actually like isn't stuff that we built, it's stuff that like we found, like the supermarket. I had a totally different idea of like the kind of supermarket that I wanted, and like Eric and I were, my DP and I were like on the way out because we were like, this just isn't right. And then I was like, wait, there's something though. And then like, I was like, oh yeah, that something are these like giant printed out pictures of like vegetables. That's so fucking weird. And there were the only things that I had them change in that location was like there were 3 flags hanging, but 2 of them were Italian flags and 1 of them was American. And I was like, to my production designer, I was like, you think they're gonna let us switch out for 3 American flags? For some reason I just knew that, you know, 3 American flags, so weird. And then I had them move the meat aisle so all of the meat could be in frame behind Maddie. But otherwise, like, I think it's a good example of just like letting the suburbs lead and keeping it tuned. To me, like, location scouting is honestly one of the biggest parts of the creative process, because in the same way that like when you cast an actor, like you had some intangible idea and now there's like a human that you have to focus on to pull like life onto the screen, like a location. So many of like the moments in my movies that I love the most, like that school hallway was just there looking like that, like with those weird signs. And I was like, we already like decided to shoot at another high school, and I was just like, I'm so sorry guys, we're gonna need an extra high school because there are these fucking crazy signs. And you know, I was like, I want to give 3 minutes of my movie to that. Yeah.
Well, speaking of 3 minutes, thank you so much for your time and so much for being this. I want to leave the floor to you before we go. Like, any parting thoughts or anything you want to tell the audience like, about the movie that we didn't cover, or just anything that's on your mind?
I definitely want to say thank you to Steffi and Ricky, who are here in the front row, who are dear friends who worked really, really hard on the movie. That thing that I talked about being like really hard, but that I'm really proud of, like they just like really helped me through it. Like basically like free therapy all summer long, and more than therapy, because there's also like a lot of love and care there, and that's just something that I'll always be incredibly grateful for. It's like the burden of like emotional labor that people in your life hold up while you do the things that are in the credits, like is a lot of labor. And so anytime you guys are at a screening, that's really sweet. And what else? I mean, the movie opens here in San Francisco and in a few other cities on Friday, which is the same day that the soundtrack drops on Spotify, so listen to that. And then it's expanding to a bunch more movie theaters nationwide on May 17th. So I think it's like a word of mouth movie, you know, and it's like do you know about this crazy thing? And so like if you resonated with it, I do think that kind of just like whisper network of like tell your weirdo friends who like would have rented Donnie Darko to like go see this movie when it comes out, because I do think that like the thing is that when you make like a movie that's personal and undefinable and not just like another horror movie, is that like everyone's kind of like, what do we do with that? And so like go tell people to watch it, I think is the answer, if you want, you know.
Everyone should be a Maddie. Anyway, thank you again, Jane, so much for this. Please give Jane a huge and continues to the same time. So thank you for all watching in every city aside Cleveland. Have a great rest of your night.